Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone, and welcome to the Muslim Voice Podcast. In today's episode of the podcast, we will be interviewing Dr. Adam Ali, who is an assistant professor of Islamic history in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at U of T. Dr. Adam Ali has taught courses on the Arabic language at the beginner and intermediate levels at the St. George and Mississauga campus, and also teaches courses on various topics and themes in Islamic history, including warfare, revolts, and slavery. In today's interview, we had the opportunity to get his perspective on themes of resilience in the life of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, as well as what it means to be resilient as a member of the Muslim Ummah. You definitely don't want to miss this. So let's now turn to our conversation with Dr. Adam Ali.
Yeah, I think now that we've opened up the topic, it's actually funny because you're right, resilience is one of the overarching lessons of the seerah itself. And there's so many different avenues you could take it. Like as a psychology student, one of the things I'm thinking is like nowadays, the idea of a victim mentality and how you just think about your childhood and all the things that went badly for you, like set you back in many ways, because there's a lot of, psychology surrounding that. But it just makes me think like the Prophet had every excuse to like kind of live a difficult life because he was actually an orphan. He went through like so many different caregivers growing up. Like he was like being an orphan is a big thing in terms of a setback. But he didn't use that. Like prophets in the Quran or in stories in the Islamic tradition generally never used like excuses to not change their lives. Like I'm also being reminded of the story of the Prophet Yusuf. I'm going to ask you now about Bilal ibn Rabah, but first, did you have any thoughts about the...
Perhaps we should start, or I should start by talking about what resilience is, right? Because when do we have resilience and what do we call resilience and what isn't? And I actually, again, myself also being a nerd, I went on to the university library website and read some papers by psychologists on resilience. And they all seem to give different definitions, but they all agree that on one fundamental point that you can't have it without adversity, right? So you cannot have resilience without adversity. So, and we can see this in our everyday lives where, some people struggle a lot more than others, and we would call those people more resilient. Whereas, if somebody's more privileged, and that's not their fault that they're privileged, but if they suffer some kind of setback, you would find that those type of people tend to crumble a lot more easily, because when you're sailing smoothly on the ocean, never encountering a storm, and then you enter your first storm, you don't know what to do. Whereas if you're in a poorly constructed boat navigating storms every other day, then you've kind of learned how to weather those storms and go through. So my point here is that resilience and failure go hand in hand. You can't have one without, resilience without that adversity, right? So if I lived my entire life and, as we said, everything was smooth, as Professor Razak was saying, if the Prophet, nobody ever resisted him, everyone just accepted everything he said, smooth sailing, we wouldn't have the seerah, as Dr. Razak very aptly described it as being an epic. And I'd like to add to that, the word seerah in Arabic does mean epic, right? So the definition of the word seerah is epic. We have other works from later in the medieval period, right? Sirat Dat al-Himma, Sirat Banu Hilal, right? These are epic stories with narratives, with arcs. And, what's an epic without adversity, without challenge, without problems that the hero or heroes have to overcome? And Musa mentioned doom. Again, what makes that story, right? I can't remember, the Atreides family's massacre, right? They massacre the guy's entire family. They kill everybody. And he and his mother survive, right? So there's that's a pretty big adversity. And he has to go into this desert that he comes from a green, watery planet, and now he's stuck in the middle of a desert after his entire family and he's privileged too, right? So you have that double edged sword there, where he's not used to this adversity. Paul, he's grown up privileged. His father is given a planet to rule. The rivals come and massacre everyone, and he miraculously escapes with his mother into the desert, into this very harsh foreign environment. And not only does he survive, but he thrives. And that is resilience, right, in that context. And we love stories like this, right? These are what make these stories exciting. Bilal ibn Rabah was an Abyssinian slave, right? So he was not himself enslaved. His mother was a slave, and he was born into slavery in Mecca and grew up a slave. Now, slavery being one of my main areas of research, I think Bilal is not well. He's unique in that he's one of the companions of the Prophet, and he becomes a major figure in early Islamic history and early Islamic narratives. But his story is a reflection of anyone that's been enslaved by anybody, right? So there are every slave's story in the history of humanity, whether it's slaves of the Roman Empire, the slaves of the American plantations, are stories of resilience, because one of the greatest forms of adversity is not having freedom, or whatever that means in the context that we're talking about. So Bilal is described as, in the sources, as being one of the earliest converts. So we don't know who converted first and the order in which people converted, but he was he converted early on. And he went through, again, according to our sources, a lot more than most of the other early Muslims went through, because he lacked the protection that other Muslims had, right? So being a slave, he did not have clan protection, he did not have family protection, he did not have tribal protection, which left him and others like him, so some of the other slaves that converted and some of the poorer individuals in Meccan society, to more vicious attacks by those who opposed the message of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and maybe an avenue through which these opposing forces could vent their anger at them, because they could not do what they did to Bilal, to say somebody like Umar ibn al-Khattab or Abu Bakr, or even to the Prophet himself, all of whom had clan protection. So these individuals did not suffer in the same way as individuals like Bilal. And Professor Razak mentioned the first hijrah to Abyssinia, to Ethiopia, was a hijrah of these weaker individuals, right? These individuals. And when I say weaker, I don't mean physically or psychologically or weaker as persons, weaker meaning that they did not have the social supports and social protections that some of the other Muslims had. These are the ones who were sent away for their own safety to the kingdom of Aksum, where the Prophet said there is a just Christian king who will protect you, right? So that protection that they were not afforded in Mecca, that through the tribal clan system, they got in this foreign land. Now, according to our sources, Bilal was taken out into the desert, and you can imagine, I've never been to Saudi Arabia, but it gets very, very hot there. And even in the winter seasons, I think it's hotter than summer is here. And the sources describe that he was tormented by his master for his conversion to Islam, being put out in the sun, having rocks rolled over him, or being beaten or whipped. Now, the sources don't tell us how long this treatment, at least I'm not sure how long this abuse went on, but according to the Siyar, Abu Bakr happened to be walking by when he witnessed this, and he, again, we get different accounts. He either exchanged Bilal for one of his slaves, right, like a non-believer slave. He's like, take my slave and I'll take this Muslim one, or he purchased him with money and freed him. Throughout this process, however long it was, Bilal was being punished by his master, or his masters, by the Meccan aristocracy, for not only for converting to Islam, but this was a form of defiance, right? And this was a form of self-determination by the slave, which, whatever slave society you look into, that was one of the things that slaves were technically not supposed to do, right? To determine, to decide for themselves as individuals. And he was being punished for all of these things. But again, according to our sources, he refused, naysay, his beliefs. And the famous, again, the Siyar all mentioned that he kept repeating throughout his torments, Ahad, Ahad, right? One, right? Meaning the oneness, right? His belief in the one deity, the one God of his new religion. So there you have it. Again, this adversity, and the sources, as we saw with, this is a mini arc, you can see, within the bigger arc of the seerah, of the life of the Prophet. The mini arc of Bilal, especially this early part of his arc, is a story of, you see an undulating wave where he goes down very low, where we're not familiar with the story and they're reading it for the first time, saying, well, is this individual going to die? Is he going to make it? Is he going to give up and renounce his faith to save himself? And it's the kind of arc, again, that teaches us a lesson about, again, resilience here. And this arc continues, right, as a sub-arc, as is, I think, the story of most of the prominent companions. There are kind of mini arcs within the big arc of the seerah of the Prophet, where we see their ups, their downs, and where they end up. And Bilal's is a pretty, I think, happy ending, where he, even though Abu Bakr purchases him, he attaches himself to Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? He becomes almost like his personal attendant, his bodyguard, and eventually the first mu'adhin, right? The first prayer caller. And in 630, when Mecca's conquered, he has the honor of climbing on top of the Kaaba and calling the Muslims to prayer for the first time, to public prayer for the first time in Mecca. In addition to that, we have the racial aspect as well, because he wasn't just any slave, right? Because during this time period and into the Islamic period as well, slavery continues, slavery is practiced. There were Arab slaves, there were slaves from the north, right? So from not as many in the pre-Islamic period, but Iranians, we'll talk about Salman in a moment, and from Syria, but a lot of them seem to have come from across the sea, from Eastern Africa, from Abyssinia and other parts. And here we have the racial aspect as well of Bilal being a person of color and a slave who managed, despite his humble beginnings, if you want to call it that, to become one of the most well-known and prominent companions who stands out in early Islamic history.
I think one interesting point is that, imagine if he'd given up. Imagine if he'd renounced his faith in that moment.
Well, it did happen. So we have Ammar ibn Yasir, also a very prominent companion, right, who also lacked the clan protection. That he was not a slave, but he came from the lower echelons of Meccan society, and him and his family were dragged out, just the way Bilal was, to be tormented by the Meccans. And according to Islamic tradition, his mother was the first Muslim to be murdered, to be killed. Yes, Sumayya. And he does in the story, he does renounce his faith, right?
Yeah.
He does do it, but does that mean there was a lack of resilience on his part? Right, that's the question. Just by giving up once or taking an avenue, this guy just watched his mother die. Right, that he watched her being tormented. Right, we have to remember that these were, again, I'm going to piggyback off of what Professor Razak said, and I think both of us really try to get this across in our courses when we teach that. Yes, these seem like larger than life figures, but they were human beings with feelings just like us. Right, with people they loved, with people they loved a lot, with people they loved less. Right, just like us, who felt things. So when Ammar ibn Yasir renounced his faith in the last moment, right, I don't think that's a very negative thing, right? And even had Bilal renounced his faith, I don't think he didn't, right? He was, again, quote unquote, resilient. I don't think that's a negative or a bad thing in this context, because they were going through things that I personally cannot imagine, right? Going through. And when Ammar felt shame after doing what he did to save himself, right? The Prophet told him, "You did the right thing." Right? The Prophet did not, peace be upon him, did not admonish him for renouncing his faith and for, I think they were forcing him to accept Hubal, or whichever deity it was, for taking Hubal's name, right? So again, we can imagine if Bilal had given up. I don't know. Maybe I think he would have gone back to becoming a Muslim, right? And we see that a lot. People under duress, confess to things, right? Even, cases of torture, right? To get a confession, they'll confess just to make it stop. And then when they're in court again, they're like, well, I take that back. I don't confess. I confess because they were hurting me. Okay, so it doesn't mean that, again, here Ammar really renounced his faith. And had Bilal done that, I don't think he would have been renouncing it because he actually believed he was renouncing it, but because it had come to a breaking point.
Considering that his mother had died because she didn't renounce her faith, and then he decided to renounce it in that moment, I agree that it probably led to him leading a longer life so that he was able to achieve more good. So it's not like I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, especially because the Prophet then
Well, again, if you look at the arc of his kind of mini arc within the larger tale of the early Islamic period, with the Sirah of the Prophet, he partakes in the early conquests, and if I'm not mistaken, he becomes the governor of Ctesiphon, right? Of Al-Madain, right? The conquered Persian capital of the Sasanian period. And he partakes in the fitna as well on the side of Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? So he has a very colorful career and is one of the most, again, a person of fairly humble origin, not as humble as Bilal, but still humble, making it quite far, which is kind of one of the other things about Islam, where it breaks down social boundaries, right? At least in the early period. Before things kind of get stratified again later on, but in the early period, it allows a lot of social mobility in the first few decades or so of Islamic history. The whole point is that to be resilient. So going back to Ammar ibn Yasir, him renouncing his faith for a moment to save himself, that in itself, overcoming that act is an act of resilience, right? The overcoming that shame and weakness he must have felt. Again, I don't know, I'm not him, but if you try to put yourself in his shoes, and I always ask students to do that, try your best to put yourself in the shoes of this person that we're talking about. What must he have felt that I have been broken by my tormentors, right? I have been forced to say something I don't believe. Right, after I watched my mother die, and they're hurting me and they're tormenting me as well, and then overcoming that, right? Overcoming that in itself is an act of resilience in itself. I wouldn't look at it as a mistake, rather than a natural inclination towards survival.
And this is the example that you provided. Do you believe that survival and resilience sometimes in particular circumstances, especially the example you mentioned, might also go hand in hand?
Definitely. So in this case, so again, people do different things to survive, right? And sometimes the actions in certain individuals might be harmful to others. Whereas in this case, with Ammar ibn Yasir, he didn't hurt anybody in his renunciation of his faith to survive, or to even save his father, who was also going through torments after watching his mother die. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got, whereas sometimes there might be a circumstance where you might lie to save yourself and then cause someone else to get hurt with your lie. And that's a whole different, it's not just, I gotta survive at all costs, right? It's not that type of survival. It's, and again, he didn't do this very lightly, right? He didn't renounce his faith just because they told him to, right? He went through a series of traumas, which is another thing that these the psychologists that wrote that, well, it was a paper summarizing a series of studies, say that people who go through these adversities and survive and have resilience usually carry with them trauma, right? Trauma and in some cases PTSD as well. You can imagine, again, as a human being, and what he went through, right? Ammar ibn Yasir, and what Bilal went through, there must have been a lot of trauma and PTSD. They weren't the field of psychology hadn't been created by them, but we have records of people in the modern world that go through war, that go through torture and mistreatment and there's a lot of trauma there.
Actually, I think that's a really good point, because the idea that resilience is something that you show once and then you move on and life moves on isn't true, because you do carry like trauma in you, like even in your physical body from experiences you've felt in the past, and sometimes finishing off the act of resilience is like working through and processing things that you've experienced in the past.
We actually carry trauma for 50 generations in our mitochondria, in our cells. There was a study just published a couple of weeks ago that I came across. So you carry the trauma of 50, I can't know, 50 or 25 generations going back. Like your cells remember and program you to react to certain things in certain ways. So that kind of addresses why some people have certain personalities and others don't.
The one question, and this maybe a question that goes outside the context, but I was thinking about resilience through names and the names that were given. I mentioned this because my youngest brother was born about a couple of years back. I was talking to my father regarding names. The first opportunity that I ever had, having that kind of conversation with him, and it made me reflect, take a step back and regarding what my name means, the power that it holds. Mm-hmm. How sometimes you live, you say you live in honor of your loved ones, but you also live in honor of the name that you're given. Now sometimes I find that actually propels you to even follow those footsteps as well. So I was wondering, and I'm opening this up for both of you, whether that you sort of have that kind of reflection regarding your name and what it represents, and how sometimes maybe inadvertently you try to stay in honor of the name that you're being given. Because I also see it in the flip side as well, that you have those individuals who have really particular names that hold a very particular level of importance, and they feel, whether it be through family, whether it be through their loved ones, that they have to stay in accordance of the thematic elements that are given within their names. And I think within that, I think there's a level of pressure that comes with it as well.
I feel like honestly, when resilience was first brought up as a topic, I only really thought about it in those cases where it's like resilience is a really huge, outward, obvious, feature. For example, obviously my mind immediately went to Palestine. But like now, as we're breaking it down, I'm thinking like that's so true. Like resilience is so like inherent to just like being human, and any amount of effort requires opening yourself up to the possibility of adversity and therefore having to be resilient. And I've always related a lot to the meaning of my name, but I've never really thought about it in the context of like, actually it's an act of resilience. Like, so my name is Rida, right? Like contentment. And whenever I'm going through like something difficult, I'm like, no, my name's Rida. Like I have to be happy about it. Like I have to be content. I have to like, I want to go back to Allah, like content with the life I lived. But I never realized like that is actually like in a way an act of resilience against.
I do sometimes think about it and what it means, and as Professor Razak said, we are given our names, and the circumstances under which my name was given to me was because of it was a compromise. It was a compromise name between my father and my mother. My father being Middle Eastern and my mother being European, and my father wanted a very Arabic name, my mother wanted a European name, and then they came together on Adam, which kind of covers a lot of bases. I wouldn't call it a global name, but I would call it a multi-faith name. Whereas it's an Abrahamic name where it's not strange to have someone Muslim, Christian, or Jew with this name. So I would call it like a kind of a name floating around without boundaries, if you will, and also going back to my childhood, I had an Arabic teacher, and one of the things I do teach in addition to Islamic history is Arabic, and a lot of the Arabic teachers in the Middle East were very angry people. I don't know why, right? They were always really, I don't know, maybe the grammar does that to them. Right? So, but when I walked in, and so Adam in some Arabic-speaking countries is more common than in others, right? So in Sudan, in Morocco, and even in Egypt, you get Adam a lot more than you do in the Levant. So I was in grade 2, and I walk in, and he's asking everyone their names. And I tell him mine's Adam, and he says, "Oh, like the Prophet, like the father of humanity?" And I'm like, "Yes." And from that day on, he never referred to me as Adam again. He referred to me as Abuna. right? Our father, right? He had a nickname for everybody, right? So he called me Abuna from grade 2 to grade 12 or something, right? Rarely ever called me by my name. So that, I don't know if that had a psychological impact, right? This idea that I was the father of the class. But all jokes aside, I've never really thought about living up to my name, because it's something that, as Professor Razak said, that was chosen for me, right, by my parents. And just as I don't think that my son is living up to his name because of the name that my wife and I chose for him, right? My son's, he has a Turkic name, Aydin, and it means enlightened, right? Right. And I was like, no, I want him to shine in everything he does, right? And I don't think, and I keep telling him, your name means this, so shine. But that's me wanting him to shine. I don't think, just as I don't think about my name that way, I don't think he thinks about his name that way. So I think names are given because your family or your culture or your parents or the people named you want you to embody what that name means.
Mention Salman bin Farsi then.
Sure. I think, well, again, Salman's story is a story of a slave, but he didn't start off a slave. His story, his arc is very different to Bilal's, and his experiences are very, very different to Bilal's. So Salman is Iranian. He's born into actually a privileged family, right? So his father was if I remember correctly, a dehqan. Dehqan in modern Persian means farmer, but in the medieval or early medieval context, it means a landed noble, right? So he was, and according to our sources, our sources are of course Islamic sources on this. He was a Zoroastrian, right? So they refer to everybody from that region as Zoroastrian, but we know that there were a multitude of belief systems and faiths. Some of them Zoroastrian-ish, and others not so much. So he, whatever his faith was, he finds out or learns of Christianity, and he gets really interested in Christianity. So he, again, according to the stories, his father kind of finds out that he's interested in Christianity, and he locks him up, right? He wants to keep, because he knows that if his son goes out and starts to learn stuff, he'll leave, and he doesn't want to lose his son. So he tries to keep his son at home. But Salman manages to get out, and he finds a monk or a priest and starts learning about monotheism. Zoroastrians are monotheists as well, to a certain extent. But he starts learning about Abrahamic monotheism, and he goes through a number of teachers. I don't remember how many, but he goes through several priests and monks, and the last of those teachers, again, we're reflecting the Islamic tradition here, the Islamic version of history, tells him that there will be a prophet in Arabia, right? So this is kind of this prophecy, this foretelling of the coming of Muhammad, and tells him, if you'd like to find out the truth, go and seek this prophet out. And this is the part of the journey where Salman becomes enslaved. So he hires a group of guides, Arab guides, Bedouin. I think it's from the Banu Kilab tribe. And along the journey, they decide to kidnap him instead of transferring him to Mecca. And he's sold into slavery in Medina, where he happens to be at the time of the Hijrah, right? So maybe it was, you could call it fate or whatever you want, but had he been taken to Mecca, he would not have found the Prophet at that point, because they were all leaving. So he learns about this, and when the Prophet, peace be upon him, is coming, he's actually up in a tree harvesting dates in one of his master's groves, and he goes to meet the Prophet and converts to Islam. And as the story goes, the Prophet and the companions managed to gather enough money to pay for his freedom. Now, this was not uncommon both in pre-Islamic and Arabia, and after the coming of Islam, where a slave could kind of make a contract with his master to work for a number of years or to be able to gather enough money to purchase his freedom. Now, with Salman's story, it's a little different from Bilal or say Ammar ibn Yasir, in that I think the beginning of the story is not really as one of resilience, but more of persistence, right? He was really like, I want to know, I want to learn. But he was being persistent. He was being very, sticking to his kind of ideas of what he wants to do. And then throughout that journey of persistence, the adversity comes that kind of transforms it into a story of resilience, where he has to go through, again, the trauma of slavery, right? Just the act of being enslaved and sold in a market at any period throughout history is a traumatic experience. So he has to go through that trauma, and then through the idea of kind of being a servile individual in society, at the doing work for his master. He is actually one of the companions that we know least about. He's one of the more kind of legendary companions whose kind of background, whose story is very hazy compared to the other ones. But his, again, claim to fame comes again in the Sirah arc, in the Battle of Al-Khandaq, where he suggests digging this trench to this ditch to defend Medina. And it should come as no surprise, being Iranian. The Iranians had, as did the Romans, a far superior military technology to the Arabs and to what the companions of the Prophet had ever been exposed to. Digging a ditch is the most basic thing. Again, as a military historian, I can tell you that is the most basic thing you can do when you're defending a location, or especially an open area. Digging a long hole and piling the dirt up on the other side to kind of make a dirt wall makes it adds an obstacle to the oncoming enemy. So when this was suggested, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the companions they all said, well, that sounds like a good plan, because the other army that's coming is pretty big, and this will help us. And they did dig a ditch across the part of Medina that was not protected by like the lava rocks and the hills. And when the Meccans and their allies showed up, they didn't know what to do. Again, they lacked the military technology or the military know-how. There wasn't any military engineering in Arabia at this time, and they had a lot of trouble getting across this. They didn't. Okay, in the accounts, a few of them do get across, but the Muslims fight them off and send them back. And this enterprise comes to naught when the army starts to break apart, because according to our sources, there were 10,000 of them. Whether that was true or not is not the issue. 10,000, these numbers just mean there was a lot. There were a lot of them, and these guys had to eat and drink, and it kind of fell apart very, very, very quickly for a number of reasons. So his kind of claim to fame is this, again, through this, again, he imprints himself in history. Now, coming back to the name question, which I should have mentioned, is that, well, what survives of these people, right? Their names, right? Names are something that survive after we die, right? For some of us, 1 or 2 or 3 generations, maybe our grandchildren, great-grandchildren remember, and others for thousands of years, as we see about, or centuries or millennia, as we see with these individuals that we're talking about. And I guess that depends on the level of their contributions or the impact, the waves of the impact they make in their societies and during their time period. So with Salman, even though he's one of the less clear characters in all the Sirah stories, his name still survives because of the imprint he left, not necessarily through his resilience through slavery, but because of the impact he had at the Battle of the Trench, which would have, again, as a military historian, would have gone very, very differently had the trench not been there, right? The Muslims would have had a very, very difficult time pushing this invading army away, and again, speaking purely out of military context, the chances are that they would have most likely been defeated had that trench not been there to stop the attackers. That's kind of persistence and resilience. That's the Salman arc.
The early part of that story reminds me of the fact that, like, so when you have to show resilience is when you're going through something difficult, right? When you're going through adversity, as you said. But in Islam, that's not the only opportunity. That's not the only form in which you're tested. Because in Islam, you're also tested when you're in in periods of ease, and how you act in those periods of ease is also like a test as well. So, yeah, I just thought that was.
Well, that is still a type of adversity, right? You're talking about temptations and stuff like that?
I guess I'm just saying, like,
But that is adversity, because if I'm tempted to look at this book, this magazine here on the table, but I'm not allowed to, that causes me internal pain, because I really want to look into that, right? So that is a type of adversity in itself, right? So I'm privileged enough to have this. It's a time of nobody's threatening me. I'm not going through hunger or pain or anything, but I really want to look at that. But Musa said, you're not allowed, right? You can't do that. And I really want to, but I'm not allowed to. So I'm holding myself back. And that in itself is resilience to the temptation, which is causing adversity to me.
As a final question for this podcast, we wanted to know, what potential would you say that the Ummah, like the global Muslim community as a whole, has the potential in terms of resilience?
When we talk about the Ummah, right, as Professor Arafat Razak mentioned, in the modern context, this is a huge entity, right? Every continent, some continents, of course, have more Muslims in them than others. It's been described as kind of diversity within unity, and it is extremely diverse. Right? You look at Muslims in Morocco, look at Muslims in Sudan, look at Muslims in Yemen, in Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and if you were to bring an alien and ask them, are these people all the same? The alien would be like, are you kidding? No, right? Yeah, there are some similarities, but we have this very, very diverse patchwork of societies and cultures within Islam. And it is one of the beautiful things about the Muslim world, where you have, I don't know the exact figures, probably Professor Razak, is it what, almost 2 billion, 1.8 billion Muslims now, or something around there. That's a lot of people. And that's a very big, when you think of yourself as a community that way, well, communities tend to be small, and the Ummah itself, like the term Ummah, when it was created, it was a community in Medina, and it wasn't necessarily the Muslim community, right? Right after the Prophet's Hijrah, they write up the Constitution of Medina, and which, again, according to scholars, was written up over. It wasn't just put together on the spot; it was written up over a number of years. But this Constitution creates the Ummah, the first Ummah. And that Ummah included the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Meccans who came with him, the Muhajirun. It included the Ansar, right, the helper, the Medinans who were known as the helpers who converted to Islam. But it also included the Jewish tribes in Medina and all the Mawali, all the clients. So it wasn't an exclusively Muslim community. Why do I bring that up? Because, again, I agree with Professor Razak in saying that the Ummah is not in opposition to other societies and cultures. There was a very, very healthy discourse throughout much of Islamic history, right? In the Abbasid courts, the Khalifa would bring in different ulama from different sects, right? Muslim ulama, different sects, and Christian priests, and there was a very, very healthy discourse. And also this idea of, Musa's story where, he kind of felt he fit into the Turkish community in Germany. That's wonderful. But again, that doesn't extend only to Muslims, right? There's a tradition, right? Let's say like a Muslim tradition or an Arabian tradition or a tribal tradition or an Eastern tradition of hospitality. So you find that when you have, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be a Muslim in a Muslim society, where you could be a tourist, right? A European or an Australian or an American who shows up somewhere in a Muslim town in Ramadan, and they will invite you to dinner. Because, again, one of the common things I think right? Despite, Nashat mentioning all the different sects and splits and the cultural splits, political and all that, is in addition to this kind of general belief in the oneness of the deity, the oneness of God, generosity is kind of very high up there as a part of Muslim values, like generosity and not being miserly, right? It's always mentioned in the Quran. Like, what do I do to be a good person, right? Feed the poor, feed the orphans.
Free a slave.
Yeah, free a slave. Don't hoard your wealth. Spread it out to the community. Spread it out not only to the community, to any guest, right? Honoring your guest, regardless of who he is, right? You honor your guest. So that is kind of one of the other things, right? Part of the identity that I think most Muslims can whatever sect they belong to, or whatever level of piety they aspire to or ascribe to, it's part of, again, this ummah, right? This idea, this notion. And coming back again to what Nashat said about this prophecy about things splitting apart, I think it goes without saying that obviously the early ummah was composed of a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people at most. It's a lot easier keeping a small group like that intact and together than millions of people over time, right? It's inevitable that once you have millions or tens of millions, now hundreds of millions of Muslims, that things get interpreted or understood in different ways. But despite that, there is this kind of feeling of belonging. No matter what ideology you follow, you belong.
The more time I spend with historians, the more I realize that basic definitions I took for granted are really just so complex.
Well, yeah, that is correct, because history is complex. People are complex, right? People, we tend to simplify things, right? When we want to understand our culture, our religion, where we came from, it's easier to have a simple idea, right? There was this guy who said this, and then there was this group, and they identified as such, and that's it, right? But when you look through, and these are the rules of the religion, and these are everything, but and we see, Nasha took my slavery course, and we see that these rules are broken, right? There's the ideals, right? Like the stuff up there in the sky that we all aspire to, but then there's the reality on the ground, which includes realpolitik when it comes to political history, where rules are bent, right? So we have the cardinal rule of slavery: you never enslave a Muslim. It's okay to enslave others, but Muslims are enslaved by other Muslims, right? Throughout history, when it was politically or economically practical. So again, there's a difference between ideals and reality and what really happened, and one doesn't cancel the other out, right? You can have those ideals and you can have those beliefs, but again, life, you tell yourself, I'm gonna, bringing it down to a simple experience that we've all experienced. I have an exam next week. I'm going to study 4 hours every day for that exam, right? That's the ideal. But then after tomorrow, your friend calls you and says, let's go have some coffee. You're like, okay, I have to study, but I'm only going to I'll come out with you for half an hour, and you end up spending the whole day with them. And that's the reality. Now that's your reality. You're 4 hours short of study time, right? You've set an ideal, but the reality dictated something else, right? So, and that's the way we can kind of view history, where you have texts and scholars writing about ideals, religious ideals, moral ideals, cultural, social, whatever. And then you have the realities on the ground. And this doesn't apply only to Muslims, it just applies to humanity in general.
We are so honored to have been able to engage in such a scholarly discussion with Professor Adam Ali to understand the profound impact of resilience in the lives of the Ummah and how the lives of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ have acted as a source of inspiration in channeling resilience. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Muslim Voice podcast and for supporting us as we aim to amplify the Muslim voice at U of T. That is all that we have for you today from the Muslim Voice podcast team, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, may peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum.